All right, we're back here on SportsLine tonight. Pretty much going around the horn on things out there. We've got the NBA playoffs. What a game last night in Oakland. I think a lot of people would sign up for 5 or 6 or 7 games of that series if we can get it. And so far, pretty good action in the hockey conference finals as well. Overtime thriller last night in Pittsburgh. Penguins evening up that series. And a good game in game 1 between the Sharks and the Blues. I think a lot of people think they are destined for a long, drawn-out series as well. It was a long, drawn-out playoff run for the Predators. Not as long as they would have liked to have been, but a franchise record 14 games, 2 more longer than they had ever had in a postseason run before. They won 7 postseason games. That's 1 more than they had ever won in a postseason before. Advanced to the second round for the 3rd time ever. Oh, so close to moving on to the Western Conference Finals for the first time, but just seemed to run out of gas last Thursday night, Game 7 in San Jose. Pekka Rinne showed up early on in that game. He seemed up to the task against the Sharks one more time, but the guys in front of him did not do a very good job. A lot of turnovers, a terrible night for Shea Weber and Roman Josi. Just maybe the worst night each of them had all season long, and they did it collectively on the biggest night of the season. Very disappointing effort for those guys. They certainly owned up to it after the game, but a flat performance, and like we said, maybe they just ran out of gas after those 14 games in the span of 29 nights during that playoff run and over 17,000 miles traveled during that time. That's a tough run. And maybe it caught up to the Preds against the Sharks team that only played 5 games in round 1, spent the entire round 1 in the state of California. Maybe it was a little bit too much to ask there at the end. Robbie Stanley, who covers the Predators for NHL.com, joined us on Sunday Sports Central. Here's our exclusive and extensive chat. Not just exclusive, but our chat extended now about this run with the Predators, what happened in Game 7, and where they go from here after the best postseason run in franchise history. We look to that future now with Robbie Stanley, who covers the Predators for NHL.com. Robbie, 72 hours later, do you have any explanation as to what happened there in Game 7?
You know, there are some moments in sports that you just can't explain, and it looked like the Predators, for whatever reason, as a team collectively, just everyone didn't have it in Game 7, and that's really rare to see. I think you can understand maybe 1 guy or 2 guys not having their best game, but it just seemed like really everybody in that locker room just didn't have anything left in Game 7. And it's one of those things in sports that I think sometimes you just can't explain. And talking to the players about it the other day at their media availability, they didn't really seem to have an answer for it either. They just didn't have it, and one wonders if maybe the travel finally caught up to them. They traveled more than 17,000 miles. They act like that's not a big deal, but I think, you know, they're all human. At some point that's going to catch up to you, and that may just be the case of what we saw the other day. They've
gone out of their way to say no excuses. That doesn't play into it. But do you think the wear and tear of 14 playoff games and 17,000+ miles did finally catch up to them?
I think it did. And, you know, they played every second day until that last Game 7. They finally got a 2-day break before Game 7 for the first time. But before that, you're talking about playing every other day, traveling back and forth from Nashville to California in both of the first 2 rounds. And I think that has a tendency, after a while, even though they are really high-conditioned athletes, I think that catches up to you after a while, and I think that's what we saw the other night.
We saw the emergence of playoffs, Colin Wilson once again this year, but the Preds didn't get much in the playoffs from the guy who led them in points during the regular season in Philip Forsberg. What does Peter Laviolette have to do to get both guys going at one time?
That's going to be a critical part of this team's future, I think, especially when you're talking about a guy like Colin Wilson in the regular season. If he's able to have a little bit more success in the regular season, if he's able to play half as well in the regular season as he did in the playoffs, you're talking about a team that's not fighting for a wild card spot. You're talking about a team that's potentially fighting for that Central Division championship. And Philip Forsberg was battling a back injury in the playoffs. I think that had a big effect on the way you saw him play. He didn't quite have that explosion. He didn't quite have that same ability to create his shot. spots, and I think that back injury played a role. So if they can get both of those guys playing at a top level all season long next season, you're talking about a team that's going to be challenging for the Central Division, I think.
GM David Poyle made a huge splash midseason by trading for Ryan Johansson. He certainly proved his worth down the stretch and in the playoffs. Do the Preds finally have enough offensive firepower to be a serious contender?
I think they do. When you're talking about Ryan Johansson, you finally have your number one center for the first time in franchise history. You have younger forwards like Forsberg, like Wilson, like Craig Smith, who was also battling an injury in the playoffs. They have a good young forward core, and then you have some veteran guys like Mike Fisher and James Neal, who had an outstanding season this year. He was very good. So I do think they have enough offense. I think maybe for the first time in franchise history, the offense isn't a question for this team, and that's very good to see if you're a Predators fan.
Yeah, Robbie, it's interesting to me that forever we've said Pekka Rinne is the goaltender for this team. You know what you get there. Shea Weber's the captain, but where do they get the offense from? Now they've got all these young stars up front that you feel comfortable about in the forwards for years to come. But how much does Rinne have left in the tank at 33? And maybe how much does Weber have left in the tank at 31 with a lot of minutes under his belt?
Absolutely. And those two have potentially become the biggest question marks for this team. When you're talking about Pekka Rinne, he's 33 years old. He's not getting any younger. He's probably not getting any better either. You have to wonder how long he can maintain this high level of play. I thought he played particularly well in that San Jose series. I thought he was really good there. He just didn't have a lot in front of him in Game 7. But, you know, he's 33. He's going to be 34 years old next season. He's dealt with a major hip injury in his career. You have to wonder how long that window of opportunity is going to stay open for this team, because the goaltender, I equate it to the quarterback in football. If you don't have a very good goaltender, you're not going to win in the playoffs. And Pekka Rinne has been really good for a long time. They need him to continue to play at a high level, particularly in this next season to keep that window open. And Shea Weber, you know, we saw it was a really bad game from Shea Weber in Game 7. Very not typical of his performance at all, but I do think that he'll rebound from that. He's a guy that works really hard. You mentioned he's 31 years old. That's not particularly old, but he's logged a lot of minutes in his career. He plays a very physical style of hockey, and I think that might catch up to him here in the next few years.
Window of opportunity for the Predators because of the youth on the roster. It feels like it's just opening, but with the age of those two guys in particular, what is the window in your mind?
I think it's 1 to 2 years where they have to strike and they have to make a serious push for the Stanley Cup, because like I said, the goaltender is the most critical position in hockey. And once they lose Pekka Rinne, or not even if they lose him, once his game starts to go on the decline a little bit, it's going to be very difficult for them to compete in the playoffs, because we've seen it with Martin Jones in San Jose and Brian Elliott in St. Louis. Both of those guys have been outstanding in the playoffs so far, and sometimes that's the difference. So I think Pekka Rinne's ability to play at a high level is really the #1 factor for this team in their window of opportunity in the next couple of years.
The #1 priority for the Preds going into the summer is re-signing Philip Forsberg, who is a restricted free agent. What else is in front of David Poyle?
He's got a decision to make with a couple of guys. You're talking about Mike Ribeiro, who didn't have a good playoff run. I think they'll probably try to bring him back. But another guy is Eric Nystrom. I mean, he played one playoff game. He's got 1 year remaining on his contract. Are the Predators going to have to buy him out? Are they going to try to trade him? Or are they going to try to mend the fence there with that relationship and see if they can find a spot for him next season? And you've got guys like Calle Jarnkrok, who are restricted free agent, goaltender Carter Hutton and Paul Gausset are both unrestricted free agents. They'll have to determine whether or not they want to bring back one or both of those guys, or none at all. So a couple of decisions for David Poyle to make, and you have to wonder what kind of moves he's going to make in free agency to try to bolster this team, because I think now is the time for him to be aggressive in free agency. You can't be complacent with the run you just made. Sure, you're relying on some of your younger forwards to continue to develop, but I do think it's the time to be aggressive in free agency and try to add to that depth a little bit.
Robbie Stanley, great stuff. Thanks for the time. Enjoy your summer now.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve.